Today I'm going to be looking at the Nascom computer. I'll be lifting the lid on the secret signals that Nascom owners use to identify each other, and I'll highlight how the Nascom computer had some part in keeping our children safe on the roads. And if that wasn't enough, I'll be filling you in on why I think these things have soul. Now, if you're not sure what a Nascom is, then to be honest, you're probably watching the wrong video. But suffice to say that this was one of the first, if not the first, home computer available commercially here in the UK. A word of warning though, if you do decide to stick around, it's very likely that by the end you'll be surfing eBay to try and get hold of one. Back in 1977-78, when the Nascom 1 and 2 were all the rage, it was electronics enthusiasts that were the main target audience. Obviously there were people out there that realised they could use them for specific tasks, engineers and so on, and one example of course was computer-based training. For example, here is the Lollipop Lady Trainer. Presumably there's a Lollipop Gentleman version out there somewhere too. I think that this must have been fairly successful, as I haven't heard of a single trained Lollipop Lady having had an accident on the roads. Although I gather one did get electrocuted, but more about that later. The inspiration for the Nascom came from the hobbyist community that had built up around the microcomputer over in the States. The hope was that the same enthusiasm could be fostered here in the UK. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the history of the Nascom, as this is well documented elsewhere. Just follow the links in the description. Except to mention that these things came as a pile of bits and had to be built, hence the enthusiastic reception from the electronics hobbyists. I mean, you had to be qualified to build one of these things. For a start, you needed to own a soldering iron, and at the very least you had to be able to recount a time when you actually picked up the right end of it. I've mentioned in other videos that in the late 1970s and early 80s no one had any idea what you would use a computer for. This of course made marketing computers fairly tricky. It's true that you could use one to control a power station, but not many people had one of those, and well, to be honest, we've covered that already. However, the big advantage in targeting the electronics hobbyist was that electronics hobbyists, at this point in history at least, didn't need a reason to own one. It was an obvious extension to their hobby. All you needed to do was show a picture of the fully built machine, list a load of technical mumbo jumbo, and you couldn't shift them fast enough. For some time, the super clever guys had already been designing their own machines or building them from magazine articles, but for the rest of us, a kit was perfect. It did cause a few problems though. Firstly, it highlighted that you weren't clever enough to design your own computer. Secondly, spending a month's wages on something that had no real use back in the late 70s led to constantly being asked the question, what do you use it for? Now, if you answered the question by saying you wanted to learn about computers, people simply responded with further questions such as why? And to be honest, there was no satisfactory answer really, and it quickly became quite annoying. As a result, most Nascom owners went underground. Even today, every now and then another Nascom owner comes out of the woodwork and owns up to still having one. But at the time this meant that the only time you could talk about Nascoms was when you were in the company of another Nascom owner. But with them all hiding, no one knew who they were. This led to secret handshakes and sly winks at parties and public events. It's not lost on me that Masonic is an anagram of Nascom 1. Anyway, in order to distance themselves from the Freemasons, many used the tried and trusted secret signal of wearing a jumper with soldering iron splashes or burns. This was something that had developed over time from the act of keeping the soldering iron tip clean. Obviously for some it was just plain incompetence. I suppose whilst we're here we'd best take a look at one. Now this Nascom is one of the rarest Nascoms you'll ever see. It's all due to its modifications and enhancements. Well, to be accurate, it's the fact that it hasn't got any. Selling a computer kit to electronics hobbyists is like selling all the bits to make the bare essentials of a car to a bunch of car mechanics. It's guaranteed that by the time each one is completed, it will look completely different to any other. Well, the same goes for the Nascom, and it means the chances of seeing an unmodified one after 43 years is pretty remote. Well, okay, fairly remote. This one though is something quite different. Looking at the top, the first thing to notice is there are at least 2 linear power supplies. In fact, there are 3, as there's one hidden behind here. 3 separate power supplies is obviously an extravagant way to get the full voltages required. Seeing these exposed like this reminds me to mention that if you're new to Nascoms and want to maintain the authenticity and excitement and adrenaline that you feel when opening the lid, you should try and make sure that as much of the mains wiring as far as possible is fully exposed. This is a great example as every panel has live mains connections. They're even live when the machine is turned off. At this point, it's probably worth mentioning that if you're a lollipop lady or gentleman undergoing training, please don't poke your fingers inside the machine. Now, I could tidy things up a bit as I have this modern switch mode power supply that could go in. Then the other three could be removed. I mean, I could pop it in there and that would leave me space for future modifications. But to be honest, I'm in two minds whether to do this as I don't want to spoil the machine's character. Obviously, if I did fit it, then I'd make sure to leave a few exposed wires, etc., just for the sake of authenticity. So this here on the top is an EEPROM board. Now, when I first got this machine, the card was enabled using a front panel switch, but this meant it was permanently tethered to the front panel, which, to be honest, is not very convenient, as every Nascom owner will tell you, these boards get removed almost daily. Now, it's one of the modifications I've removed, as these EEPROM boards support page mode, so now I just leave it paged out of memory and page it in as required using the NAScas monitor program. I actually have a brand new EEPROM board from Richard, better known as Code Squeak. I still have to build it, but I'll do the same thing with this and it will allow me to support multiple configurations of the machine just by switching pages, which is pretty cool. The switch now enables some PolyDOS ROMs on the main board for use with the disk emulator, but more on that later. Further down we have this I/O board, which is one of those boards that could prove really useful, but often doesn't. Nevertheless, I'm very pleased to have it. The next time I need to control a nuclear power station or something, I'll have everything I need. This here is a 64K memory board, which, well, no surprise, has 64K of memory. There are a couple of minor mods on this board, but nothing significant. This full-size board is the animated graphics board designed by Mr. S.J. Holmes and shared in the January 1983 edition of the Radio and Wireless World. This is pretty special. It provides high-res graphics, sprites, a real-time clock, analog ports, stereo sound and a whole bunch of other stuff. At least it will once I get it working. At the moment, the graphics work as does the joystick, and there's more computer-based training software here designed to teach you how to fly a helicopter. At this point, I must give a big shout out to those on the Nascom group who helped me get this to this point. The main Nascom board is somewhat tethered to the case with its spider's web of connections. I'm currently about 90% of the way through capturing all these additions. Once that's complete, I'll add a header here where the modulator once was, so that the board can simply be unplugged from a wiring loom within the case. This piece of Lego is a new addition. It's used to support the board above, which is something else that needs sorting out for all the boards going forward. Neal Crook gave me some card guides, so I may try to use these. Around the inside of the case there are a few more goodies. Here is a sync separator, which takes the component video output from the graphics card and provides both analog and TTL RGB with a separate sync. The switch here switches between analog and TTL, or at least it did. I decided to take the board out, which is why nothing's connected to it. The component out from the graphics card is now routed directly to the front panel connector, as this is what I need for the monitors I have. And now I have a spare switch for something new. This here is a Vero board built preamp for the cassette input. The amplified signals are routed to this phase modulator demodulator board, which is also built on some Vero board. All of this provides a really reliable 4800 baud cassette interface, but more on that later. An unmodified machine such as this, like most computers from the period, has character, little design quirks and compromises that are part of its makeup. But for this one, it's clearly had a life. I mean, it started off here and has been lovely and modified ever since. As you've seen, things have still been refined today. I mean, we have a new Lego brick, for example. Like many modified machines, it came with its pile of documentation. Some of it's official, some of it not so. We have letters, we have handwritten notes, we have some hand-drawn circuit diagrams with extra snowbake. Here's a magazine article that was the basis for the 4800 baud cassette modification. Even that's been modified. With all the snowpack and the annotations and so on, you can see some of the thinking that went on at the time, the decisions that were made and so on. Now, these details are really details of the machine's journey, the machine's life. All of this care and attention, or providence if you like, gives this Nascom a history and a story. It wasn't long after buying it that I realised that I'm just a small part of this story, as it's had a life of its own, which will continue long after I'm gone. I'm just a temporary custodian. As Henry Thoreau once said, we don't own things, they own us. Now this Nascom too is an inanimate object, albeit with some character. But this machine has a history. It's had relationships. Its custodians have poured their hearts and souls into it. As a result, it's become far more than a box full of bits. There's an unexplainable essence for these things. These things have soul. Given that this machine is part of the family and will outlive me, the best thing I could do is to make sure that everything is fully and accurately documented. By combining all of the documents I've received and laboriously tracing wires and so on, and I have fairly accurate circuit diagrams of what's going on in the machine, so that when it leaves me, the next custodian can better enjoy it and perhaps further add to its story. So what are the options for a wannabe Nascom custodian? Well, if you wanted to play God and create the soul of a Nascom from scratch, you're going to need one of these. A completely standard, unmodified Nascom, or one of these, a kit. Well, good luck with that. The truth is that you're probably better off all round to develop a relationship with a living Nascom, a machine that already has history, a machine with soul. I would try and get one with as many mods as you can and then learn and document and understand them to try and relive its history. It's not all plain sailing though. The first issue for many owners of a Nascom is the keyboard. There seems to be more Nascoms out there than there are keyboards. The keyboards are quite special in that they don't have any contacts, just some arrangement involving saturated transformers and some other gubbins that means they'll last forever, which is handy as this is the length of time it'll probably take you to find one. It turns out that any serial device can get you going if you make a few simple mods to the serial port. Whilst this is okay, a far better method is to head over to Neal Crook's GitHub page and build yourself one of these. This is Neal's PS2 keyboard adapter board. This takes a PS2 keyboard and with some carefully crafted keycaps makes a really nice solution. Obviously, when an original keyboard does come up on eBay, you'll be able to bid for it along with 40 or so other people, including me. The next issue for a custodian tends to be data storage. I mean, cassettes are probably not the best method of storing software given the digital world we live in. Having said that, this particular machine's got a 4800 baud cassette interface, which to be honest is pretty fast. I'd spent quite a bit of time to get this working and discovered that with the preamp set to around 10 times the normal level, it worked really well. It's pretty loud though, and fast. Of course, disk drives are much better. Now, to get disk drive performance, you could get yourself one of these and some discs. Alternatively, you could even get yourself one of these with some discs. However, like many other machines of the era, the Nascom shares much of its cassette serial hardware with the RS-232 port. On this particular machine, I can switch between the cassette and the serial ports by means of this switch here. And it means that data can be saved or recorded in digital form from the serial port. Whilst this is okay, a far better method is to head over to Neal Crook's GitHub page and build yourself one of these. This is a great little device and can emulate a disk drive or a cassette or both. Clearly adding something like this to the system takes away some of the nostalgic feeling you get when using an actual cassette. But you just have to be creative. Of course, it's very common for Nascom owners to not bother putting the thing in a case and to simply have it littered across the table. After all, it makes it much easier to modify. And as I mentioned earlier, a dangerously exposed machine enhances that feeling of nostalgia. But if, like me, you have inquisitive grandchildren, the feelings of nostalgia can turn to panic pretty quickly. So as you get older and the family gets bigger, sooner or later you will want to put it in a case. Of course, you could try and find yourself a Kenilworth case. Well, good luck with that. Of course, a Nascom 3 comes in a case, which is not the way to do things in my opinion. A much better way is to make your own case. This is Vernon's homemade reproduction of the Kenilworth case. Amazing work. There are many possibilities. Here's a portable machine that sits in the Centre for Computing History in Cambridge. And not to be outdone, here's my own Nascom portable project. With a Nascom in here and a keyboard here, hopefully we'll still have enough room for a few extra enhancements. All I have to do then is connect this to a small portable monitor and we're good to go. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that it's not ideal, and of course you're right. But the thing is, I had to use a modern power supply as I simply couldn't fit the original one in. At least I can take my Nascom to work with me now, and I still have room for some sandwiches and a few essentials. As I mentioned earlier, there was a mountain of documentation that came with this machine. And a lot of software on cassette, most of which is now archived. I still have some sorting to do, but what's really nice is that every now and then I find a new annotation, usually written in pencil or something, that adds a little bit to the machine's story. But documentation isn't the only thing I've become the custodian of. There's also a programmable graphics card, an EEPROM programmer, an EEPROM emulator, a joystick, and loads of other assorted items. There's even a teletext graphics card. I think maybe it's time there was a Nascom Telstar client. So there you have it, the Nascom, a machine with soul, something to be proud to have stewardship of. And I would just ask that if you find yourself being owned by one of these, can you try and maintain its essence? In other words, keep its soul safe. Whilst at the same time, of course, not electrocuting any more lollipop ladies, or gentlemen, of course. See you next time.